We would like to begin the meeting. Board members, please take your seats. And this is the first time we're video recording our meetings, so please make sure your mics are on. When you talk, it's the little button on the front and the green light will come on. Can I get a public member of the board to call the meeting to order, recognize a quorum, and convene an election of an acting presiding officer for the purposes of this meeting?
I'd be happy to do so. My name is Stephen Flax. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board to order, and I'd like to recognize that there is a quorum with 8 members currently present. I would also like to put forth a motion to nominate Celia Hosa as the acting presiding officer of this meeting. Given that the mayor has not made an appointment of an actual new chair as of yet, pursuant to Section 26-510 of the Rent Stabilization Law. As a public member, her nomination to preside over this meeting is consistent with the intent of the Administrative Code. Cecilia will not exercise any statutory power of the RGB chair, but rather only a parliamentary presiding power for limited purposes of the meeting itself. Do I hear a second of this motion?
Is there any opportunity for comment, please?
I'd like to second that motion.
I would like to make a comment before there's any second.
Sure.
With all due respect to Ms. Hosa, I believe that it is more appropriate to have a public member that has served on this board with experience, with understanding of the proceedings. I think it is not appropriate for someone that has absolutely no knowledge of our process, of our meetings, of anything to do with the Rent Guidelines Board to be now presiding over a meeting. I do understand it is simply for administrative purposes. She has no power of any sort, but I think that it is much more appropriate for public member David Wenk to preside over this meeting.
Any other discussion regarding this issue?
I'd just like to say, just on why I think it's appropriate. It seems like Cecilia Hosa has a tremendous amount of experience dealing with this issue of rent stabilization. And today we're looking through 2 issues, and it seemed really appropriate for us to be able to move forward with a new day, with a new voice, and have her the opportunity to chair this one meeting, give the mayor the opportunity to take who he wants to be chair of the Rent Guidelines Board into account. And since he's appointed Cecilia, it seems appropriate that she be able to chair this meeting.
May I just add that I have no knowledge at all of Ms. Hosa's understanding of rent stabilization. There's been absolutely no information about any of the public members that were appointed by Mayor de Blasio until, I guess, half an hour before the start of this meeting. I don't think that that's the right way of conducting this board. I think that this board is not a political board. It is a board that is supposed to be analyzing data, and I understand that the mayor has his prerogatives, and he certainly may and certainly has the authority to appoint anyone that he feels appropriate. But this is not a matter of someone's cutting off the mayor's rights in any way. This is simply a proposal that someone that has served on this board with knowledge and understanding of our process to be the one presiding over it for today's proceedings.
What is the protocol for making decisions?
Well, at this point, there's a motion on the table that needs to be seconded. If the
And
discussion-
I second the motion.
That's been seconded.
Okay, Ms. Hosa, do you accept this nomination? All right, Andrew, would you please call the
All
roll?
right, so-
And I do want to make certain that Ms. Cruz's comments are recorded in her comments,
Yeah,
noted.
they'll be on the record, sure. So I'll just call out the roll, and please vote yea or nay for the motion. Magda Cruz?
Here?
Oh, we're
No,
voting, no.
I vote no.
Okay. Harvey Epstein?
Yes.
Stephen Flack?
Yes.
Shayla Garcia? Yes. Cecilia Hoza? Carol Shine?
Yes.
David Wank?
Yes.
Sarah Williams Willard?
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Hoza?
Okay. Good morning, everyone.
I'm sorry, wait, let me just say, so we needed five, yes, yays to pass. We have 6, so the motion passes. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Rent Guideline Board's first meeting of 2014. This is the first meeting in a series of public meetings to determine renewal lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2014, and on or before September 30th, 2015. I will now take the roll call. Please respond if present. Magda Cruz,
Present.
Harvey Epstein,
Present.
Stephen Flax,
Present.
Shayla Garcia, Cecilia Hoza, Carol Shine,
Present.
David Wank,
Present.
Sarah Williams Willard.
Present.
I would like to introduce myself. I'm Cecilia Hoza, a newly appointed public member of the RGB. I'd like to welcome the other new members of the board and say hello to those who have served in prior years. I look forward to working with each and every one of you. City Hall anticipates the RGB chair will be appointed by our next meeting. In your folder, you will find a copy of the 2014 Mortgage Survey Report, which will be presented at today's meeting. In addition, Dr. James F. Hudson will be presenting his paper entitled Comparing the Price of Index of Cost Operating Cost and RGB Income and Expense Study. Chairman Jonathan Kimmel, prior to his resignation from the board, commissioned Dr. Hudson to review the differences and limitations with the 2 indices of owner expenses and to offer suggestions in how to update the PIOC so that it represents current expenditure patterns. A copy of these papers is also in your folders. Our next meeting will be here at the Landmarks Preservation Commission Conference Room on April 10, starting at 9:30 a.m. Staff will be presenting the 2014 Income and Affordability Study. In addition, we will be hearing testimony from the New York City Department of Housing and Preservation Department. And there are copies of the current 2014 meeting schedule in your folders, and it can also be found on our website at nycrgb.org. Please note that the annual filing of the Conflict of Interest Board Financial Disclosure Report filing period will run from April 7, 2014 through May 2, 2014. Individual packets for board members should be ready prior to our April 10 meeting. Unless otherwise directed, we will distribute the packets at our next meeting. Also, in your folder, you will find non-public per diem forms, and any questions, please address Andrew. I will now introduce Brian Huberman, the RGB Research Director, to present to the board the 2014 Mortgage Survey Report. Please note that there are copies of this report here today, and it will be made available on our website after the meeting.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Everyone. The slideshow will start in a moment. Since the mid-1980s, the Rent Guidelines Board has been conducting the mortgage survey, which gives a sample view of the lending market faced by borrowers. The board is required by the rent stabilization law to consider the costs and availability of financing in its deliberations. In compliance with the law, each January we send out surveys to financial institutions that underwrite mortgages for multifamily properties in New York City. The survey covers 4 main areas: new and refinance loans, underwriting criteria, non-performing loans, and the characteristics of buildings and lenders' portfolios. Survey findings are collected in the Mortgage Survey Report, which highlights changes in the New York City multifamily lending market during the prior year. The report itself is divided into 3 sections: a cross-sectional analysis, which looks at all the respondents; a longitudinal analysis, which looks at only those lenders responding in both the current and prior year; and in addition to the survey analysis, we also examine rent-stabilized building sales data. Each winter, the Rent Guidelines Board surveys institutions that offer loans for multiple dwelling rent-stabilized properties in New York City. The survey sample is updated each year to include only those institutions that continue to offer new and refinance mortgages. This year, 14 responses were received from the 28 surveys mailed, a 50% participation rate, and this is the same number of lenders that responded last year. Before going into detail, here is a brief summary of our key findings. Interest rates charged on new and refinance loans increased. Upfront fees, also called points, for new mortgages decreased, but increased for refinance loans. Vacancy and collection losses declined. Lending volume for new loans increased, but declined for refinance loans. Maximum loan-to-value ratios increased. And in our analysis of building sales data, the number of rent-stabilized buildings sold in 2013 increased. Average interest rates increased this year. This year's average interest rate for new multifamily mortgages was 4.89%, an increase of 0.53 percentage points, or 12% from last year. Similarly, the average current rate charged for refinance mortgages rose to 4.91%, a 0.47 percentage point increase, or 11% from the prior year. This graph shows average interest rates charged for new mortgages over the last 34 years. This year's interest rates increased after last year reaching their lowest level in this survey's history. Like interest rates, points, which are upfront service fees that were charged for new loans, declined, but for refinance loans increased from the prior year. Average service fees charged on new loans by lenders was 0.54, down from 0.59 a year earlier. Points on refinance loans rose, however, to 0.50 from 0.40 last year. Points that were charged for new and refinance loans ranged from 0 to 1.5 points, with 5 surveyed lenders charging no points on either new or refinance loans. This graph shows the average points charged for new mortgages since the early 1980s. After averaging at or above, or well above 1 point in the 80s and most of the 90s, average fees on new loans have dropped in most years and fell again slightly this year to an average of 0.54 on new loans. And just to remind you that all the graphs in the presentation are also in the report, if you want to look at them further. For the first time in 3 years in this survey, new loan volume increased. An average of 61 new loans per institution were financed this past year, doubling from 30 last year. For refinancing, however, average loan volume declined from 57 last year to 46 this year. Lenders surveyed, for the most part, remained flexible in the loan terms they offered their borrowers. Since survey respondents typically provide a wide range of terms rather than a single number, we can't give a precise average for the range of terms offered by institutions, but they remain similar to those offered in recent years. Mortgage terms reported by respondents fell within a wide 5 to 30-year range. 5 lenders offered terms as long as 30 years, while just 1 offered a maximum of 5 years. This year's lenders, on average, minimally adjusted standards in lending practices. For all institutions, the typical maximum loan-to-value ratio, which is the maximum dollar amount respondents were willing to lend based on a building's value, ranged from 65 to 82.5%. The average was 72.7%, up from 71.3% in 2012. The debt service ratio, which is net operating income divided by the debt service, remained virtually unchanged this year, with an average debt service requirement of 1.24 versus 1.25 last year. Overall, just 1 surveyed lender reported making changes in their underwriting standards since last year. As this graph shows, lenders' standards for maximum loan-to-value ratios rose upward most years in the early to mid-2000s, but fell in most years for the last decade, with a couple of exceptions, including this year, when the loan-to-value ratio rose from 71.3 to 72.7% this year. A rising loan-to-value ratio means lenders have increased what they are willing to lend based on the building's value. Respondents were asked whether their new financing rates, refinancing rates, loan-to-value ratios, and debt service coverage requirements for rent-stabilized properties were higher, lower, or the same as for other properties. Most lenders in the survey, 82%, reported that their standards were no higher for rent-stabilized buildings than for non-stabilized properties in all three categories. Fewer lenders reported that they had non-performing loans this year. However, those with non-performers saw them make up a higher proportion in their portfolios. 23% of lenders reporting having non-performing loans over the past year, down from a third in the prior year. Of those lenders with non-performers, they represented on average 2.2% of their lending portfolio this year, up from 1.3% the prior year. In addition, the proportion of institutions reporting foreclosures increased, up 15% last year, from 15% last year to 23% this year. Of those that did report foreclosures this year, they represented 1% of their portfolios, up from 0.5% the prior year. The typical size of buildings in surveyed lenders' portfolios vary. The most commonly reported building size this year was 1 to 10 units, with 36% of lenders reporting that, while the remaining lenders reported an average size of either 20 to 49 units, 21% reported that, or 14% reported the other three category of building sizes. Average operating and maintenance expenses rose while average rents among buildings and lenders' portfolios fell. Expenses rose 1.5% to $659 per unit, and average rents fell 1.2% to an average of $1,245 per unit per month. Because average expenses rose and average rent fell, the average O&M cost-to-rent ratio increased from 51.5% last year to 52.9% this year. Lenders are asked whether the rent-stabilized buildings, which are offered mortgage financing, contain commercial space. Just like last year, all lenders reported that buildings in their portfolio contain commercial space, though the average amount varies depending on the lender. Among the lenders, buildings containing commercial space represent, on average, 20% of their lending portfolio, down from 27% last year. For the third time in 4 years, vacancy and collection losses declined, down from 4.07% last year to 3.35% this year, the lowest level in the survey's history. Similarly, a lower proportion of lenders reported losses of 5% or more this year, to just under a third, down from half last year. Looking at vacancy and collection losses historically, this graph goes back almost 2 decades, and the most recent figure is on top. Vacancy and collection losses have fallen, as I said, in 3 of the last 4 years, including this year, falling from 4.07 last year to 3.35% this year, the lowest level in this survey's history. The survey asks lenders whether they retain their mortgages or sell them to secondary markets. Among the lenders, 79% retain all their mortgages and 21% sell all their mortgages. It's the same proportion as last year. Of those institutions that sell their mortgages, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae are the typical purchasers. The survey asks lenders about their portfolio's performance compared with expectations at the time of initial loan origination with regard to net operating income, debt service coverage, and O&M expenses. The majority of lenders reported that their expectations had been met or exceeded in all 3 areas among their rent-stabilized portfolio. Specifically, 83% said both NOI expectations and debt service were equaled or exceeded, and 75% said O&M expenses expectations were equaled or better than expected. Now we'll move on to the longitudinal analysis section, which looks at data from lenders who responded in each of the last 2 years. This year's longitudinal analysis reveals data that is similar to this year's cross-sectional sample because all but one surveyed lender responded both last year and this year. The average interest rate among the longitudinal group for new loans was 4.83%, up 0.42 percentage points from last year's longitudinal group rate of 4.42%. Similarly, the refinancing rate rose from 4.5% last year to 4.85% this year, a 0.35 percentage point increase. Like the cross-sectional group, average points offered by lenders fell for new loans, but rose for refinance loans among the longitudinal group. The sample reported an average of 0.48 points for new loans, down from 0.59, and 0.52 points for refinance loans, up from 0.44 last year. The average maximum loan-to-value ratio rose this year among the longitudinal group, increasing to 72.5%, up from 71% last year. By contrast, the average debt service ratio changed little, at 1.24 this year versus 1.25 last year. Like the cross-sectional analysis, vacancy and collection losses declined, and they fell to 3.29% this year versus 4.08 last year. Looking at the rate of delinquencies among the longitudinal group, non-performing loans rose to 2.2% among the 3 lenders reporting them, up from 1.3%, and foreclosure rates also rose from 0.5% to 1% among the 3 lenders reporting foreclosures in their portfolios this year. Now we'll move on to the analysis of sales data. About 7 years ago, the New York City Department of Finance began offering online public property sales information. Using this data, we have analyzed rent-stabilized building sales in each of the last half-dozen mortgage survey reports. This year, we follow up with a look at the data from calendar year 2013 and compare it to the prior year. In 2013, 1,431 buildings containing rent-stabilized units were sold in New York City, 26% more than in the prior year. Sales volume more than doubled in Queens, up 114%, followed by the Bronx, up 20%, Brooklyn, up 19%, and in Manhattan, up 11%. And as in prior years, we do not include Staten Island in this analysis because there were too few rent-stabilized building sales. Looking at sales data by building size, among the smallest size rent-stabilized buildings sold in 2013, 6 to 10 unit buildings, sales volume was up 43% citywide. Sales rose 13% among 11 to 19 unit buildings. They also rose 13% among 20 to 99 unit buildings. And among the largest buildings containing over 100 units, sales rose the most, up 81% over the prior year. This graph illustrates sales over the last decade. They peaked in 2005 when 1,816 buildings containing rent-stabilized units were sold citywide. By 2009, however, sales volume declined to just 521 buildings. But since then, sales volume citywide has increased annually to 1,431 buildings sold this past year, up 26% from the prior year. Now we'll move on to a brief analysis of buildings, the prices of buildings sold in 2013. The median citywide sales price was about $2.5 million in 2013. The highest median sales price was in Manhattan at about $5.7 million, followed by the Bronx at about $2.9 million, Queens at about $1.6 million, and Brooklyn at just under $1.2 million. Now, looking further at the change in sales prices, among the smallest buildings, those containing 6 to 10 units, median prices rose the most in Manhattan. Among 11 to 19 unit buildings, prices rose the most in the Bronx. In Manhattan, sales prices also changed the most among 20 to 99 unit buildings, and we are not able to analyze change in prices among 100 plus unit buildings because there are too few to measure the change. So I will sum up the 2014 mortgage survey report. Interest rates charged for new and refinance loans increased over the prior year. Service fees fell for new loans, but rose for refinance lending. Underwriting criteria was little changed. Vacancy and collection losses declined to their lowest level in the survey's history. And rent-stabilized building sales volume increased citywide to its highest level in 6 years. Thank you. I will now take any questions you might have.
Yeah, I have a question. Thanks, Brian. I guess reflecting the increased liquidity and the robust sales, out of the 14 respondents, do you have any of the historically non-traditional sort of lenders, the Wall Street crowd, the hedge fund crowd, that kind of, private equity? And if so, do you think that distorts the market? Who's responding, I guess? And is the non-traditional lender part of this mix?
It's predominantly banks. There's just a couple of non-traditional lenders that are like the Community Preservation Corporation.
CPC, you're saying?
CPC.
But no traditionally Wall Street players or hedge funds? Or
No,
anything
we
like
don't
that?
have those in our survey.
Brian, do we ask them for the information? There's a lot of private equity money that rolls into New York's real estate market. Some say up to 25% of the lending is being provided through those institutions. I'm wondering, have we even talked to them about their lending practices?
Well, we would be willing to send out surveys to anyone who is willing to do it, or if you give us any names of lending institutions, non-traditional or traditional. Every year we do ask the lenders in our survey who their competitors are, so that's a good way to reach out to find others.
Do we have names of the current respondents?
We can provide that to you. It's not, we don't specify them in the report, but we'll give them to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we did send out to 28 institutions and 14 came back. So we'd have to take the look at the list and see who didn't respond. So, it's a volunteer survey, so we do with what we can. But I do want to point out that the people who did respond in the loan volume, the floor that we got was about 43%. Right, Brian? It was like 43% of the sales that we recorded through the sales data by finance. So we are getting a good chunk of people. And one of the lenders whose portfolio was over $1 billion didn't tell us how many loans. So it even represents, I think, more of that percentage.
Right.
So I think it's not everything, but it's something, because it does match with the building sales from that same time period. So we are capturing a good portion of that.
But Andrew, there's a lot of what we call mezzanine debt that's not on the property, so it's not recorded debt. So we don't know how much mezzanine debt is out there and what those issues are. So it would be great to have that information collected so that it'll be useful information in making our decisions around how valid the data that we have is here. I'm wondering if there's a way that you could look into, there's lots of reports and information about this kind of mezzanine debt issue and how it affects rent-stabilized units.
Sure, we'll look into that.
Excuse me for a second. Harvey, I just want to clarify. Actually, mezzanine debt is often recorded. And there's intercreditor, not just dialogue, but actually documentation between the first mortgage and the mezzanine. So I think it's actually a great idea to distribute who these lenders are, and if they're portfolio lenders, if they're balance sheet lenders, and understand the basis of it. But it was a great yield, statistically significant yield of respondents, and depending upon the volume of their lending, that's a great, you've gotten a great response. I actually just had a quick clarifying question about, are these normalized for all non-recourse loans? So these are the rate, the leverage amounts, these are all non-recourse loans, correct?
Well, if you look actually in tiny print, the survey, the specific questions are there on page 15. I don't think we get into that nitty-gritty of what they're reporting to us, so I haven't explored that.
Okay.
I had another quick question, Brian, and Sarah, thanks for clarification. I thought most mezzanine debt wasn't recorded, but in the experiences we have that it isn't, but maybe some are recording that, so it's good to know. So that's easier information to find. It'll be easier for us to be able to gather that detail. And I'm wondering that with all these vacancy losses down, can we reduction in vacancy losses? I'm wondering what dollar amount were associated with that reduction in vacancy loss for property owners, since it seems like it's a substantial reduction at this point.
Like if you look at the survey, it's very limited as to what we actually ask. We can't put any dollar amounts, we don't ask them for that much detail in our survey. I mean, this is just, report generally measures trends, and, you know, because it's difficult to actually get them to spend the time to do the survey, we don't try to ask for too many specific details about it.
Just for us, it'd be, at least for me at least, that the dollar amount, the change in dollar amount and the reduction in vacancy loss would be useful information to have if it's at all collectible, because it really changes the economic picture of the property owner based on, you know, an increase or decrease in that amount.
I mean, coming up later this spring, in the income and expense study, that probably does a better measure of measuring income and costs, because that's actually reported dollar by dollar by the building owners.
Right. But that's 2-year-old data, right?
Right, yeah. Well, we'll certainly look into adding that to our survey.
Thank you.
We can add it. This is a very limited number of buildings that we're dealing with when we're in terms of a portfolio for lender, in terms of the income and expense study, that is thousands of, you know, buildings, hundreds of thousands of units. So this may be more timely, but I think the other is more representative, to be honest, of what's going on with vacancy collection law.
And just a point of clarification, Freddie and Fannie do not respond to the
Actually,
request.
one of I think it was Fannie responded, not Freddie. One of them responded this year, so,
All right,
but we
thanks.
asked both of them.
Brian, just one takeaway that I have from this report is basically that interest rates are going to be going up. I mean, is that fair to conclude?
Well, we do measure interest rates for the last year. I can't predict where they'll be going in the future.
True, but they seem to be on the upswing if there's a trend to be taken from this information and how the economy is going, no?
Well, I mean, we measured interest rates from the last year to this year increasing, and I don't want to make any guesses as to where they might be in next year's survey.
That's a big factor for the property owner in terms of getting the loans and in refinancing. So that's a takeaway for me anyway.
I think also, right, a big takeaway is that if there is an increase in the interest rate, but the vacancy have decreased, right, that they're making also similar maybe gains. That's why I think that the point that Harvey was making earlier about, you know, the amount of, like the dollar amount would be interesting to see, right?
Right.
Can I ask one other question, Brian? You talked about the sales, the large volume of increase in sales. I'm wondering if you have the data of the change of the per unit prices in sales in each of the boroughs, because I know Manhattan was skewed much higher, but it seemed like in the Bronx at least there was a huge sales price increase. I'm wondering if it's how it connects to the unit size of each of the buildings.
Well, we received this data, and it's really, I mean, we break it down by building size. We don't analyze it any further by unit size. So I couldn't really say, other than the general trends you see in the report. I don't think I could break it down any further.
Is it possible to get the unit calculation and the change in the unit price in per borough? Because I know that's available publicly, that other for-profit businesses talk about those calculations. I'm wondering.
That is in the data. We can certainly try to break it down and report back to you what it is per
That
unit.
would be useful for us as well, to see if there's not just a shift in the volume of sales, but in price per unit in the sales too. And what neighborhoods that's affecting too in rent-stabilized population.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think if we broke it down too much, like by neighborhood, there might be too few buildings to actually
Yeah, I just mean by
measure
borough,
trends.
yeah.
Yeah, by borough, we can
Yeah,
certainly do.
that would be great.
Our next order of business is a presentation by Dr. James F. Hudson entitled Comparing the Price of Index of Operating Cost in the RGB Income and Expense Study. As I stated earlier, the previous chair commissioned Dr. Hudson to review differences and limitations with these two indices of owner expenses and to offer suggestions in how to update the PIOC so that it represents current expenditure patterns. Dr. James F. Hudson has been providing technical assistance to the Rent Guidelines Board for over 25 years, primarily with respect to the PIOC. His work has focused on quality assurance, process improvement, and methodology. He received his PhD in civil engineering from MIT in 1975 and has worked professionally on the environmental quality, energy, housing, database design, and applications development in support of regulatory agencies. Dr. Hudson, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here. I realized as we were setting up for the meeting that the first price index that I actually can remember clearly working on was the 1982 version, so I think it's over 30 years now. It's been a while. And I've continued helping with methodology and tech support over the years. Last year, we decided to do an analysis to look at where the price index and the income and expense study, how similar they were, where they were diverging, how we might be able to improve the methodology and the price index. And let me walk through some of the pieces of that. So, the income and expense study, which we've been doing since the early 1990s, takes the data reported by the property owners in the RPIE statements and does both a longitudinal and cross-section analysis on that. And you'll be seeing the latest version of that later this spring. I'm not sure whether Andrew or Brian or Danielle will be presenting it, but it'll be coming along in one of your later meetings. And then the price index of operating costs is an attempt to try to see how operating cost prices have changed from year to year based on a market basket of goods and services similar to the consumer price index or the producer's price index. We go out and we measure the prices for various things that landlords are likely to be buying as part of their cost of doing business and how those have changed over the years. And that has the advantage of being current. We're looking at very recent prices, comparing year to year. But some other disadvantages that I'll get to shortly. So moving on. The RPIE data only handles buildings with 11 or more units. Obviously, we have a significant number of rent-stabilized buildings that are in the 6 to 10 unit building category. And it takes about a year or so after the end of a calendar year for the data to become available. The report you'll be getting this spring will have the 2012 RPIE data in it, so there's always a delay there. Price index, market basket of goods and services, as I measured, and changes in prices. And we collect price data through till March of the current year, comparing year to year. The first task in looking at this was to see how different is the data on changes in operating costs that we get from the PIOC versus the income and expense study, and then try to analyze some of the reasons for those differences. And based on that, see if we can find ways to improve what we're doing in the PIOC. So, in the report, you've got all the data and all the details on this, but basically, the PIOC over the 20 years was growing at about 5.2% a year. The I&E data grew at more like 4.3% a year. They were very similar during the first half of that period, during basically the 1990s and very early 2000s. And in the second half, diverged on a more strongly diverged over the course of the period. And you'll see regression analyses in there for the various components of the two indices, which show where some of the differences are. We'll get to some of those. So, talking a little bit more about the PIOC. like any price index, we originally, and this is way back into the early 1980s, with some updates later on, did a very detailed survey of landlords about their expenses, categorizing those expenses into 9 components and a few dozen items within those. The items ranging from painting to type of oil to non-union labor, union labor, various other categories. Detailed information about expenditures. And then each year, we get current prices. And based on those prices, we will modify the weights we use in the next year's price index, how important each of those categories of expenditures is considered to be. If you take a really simple example of that, let's say we have 2 categories of expenditures, A and B, and they're each half of the index in 1 year. Now, one of those from year to year doubles in price. The other one cuts its price in half. When that happens, we readjust the weights because the next year around we're expecting the one that doubled in price to actually be more of the total portfolio of what the landlord is buying than the one that cut its price down. They may buy the same amount of both items, and in fact they're expected by the methodology to buy the same amount of each item, but since the price has changed, the expenditure weight changes. So each year we use the index to calculate the weights for the next year, which is a standard price index approach, which also leads to some problems, especially as we move over time. Now, we don't quite have a pure price index. There are some areas where we actually look at actual expenses, and those are, as mentioned here, real estate taxes, management fees, insurance, and non-union labor. Oil and gas, we look at prices, but we look at it on a month, we look month by month so that we can apply heating degree days to calculate an annual price. It wouldn't be fair if, to say the prices are unchanged if, for example, in 1 year, the price was really low in the whole summer months for oil and gas. If the other year, they were really high in the winter months, but they averaged out the same. You've got to take into account the actual heating season when dealing with oil and gas. But, aside from that, it really is a price index methodology. So, the main issues on the PIOC, the main limitation is that the market basket that we're using may no longer represent what landlords are actually buying. And if you think about that, if the last update of the actual expenditure weights, the starting point for the market basket of how much of each item the landlords are buying was done back in the 1980s, there have clearly been changes in the mix since then. We know that. The issue up until recently has been that every time we looked at, and the last time for this was probably 15 years ago, looked at trying to go out there and do another detailed expenditure survey. 15 years ago, we were looking at costs of over $200,000. It just wasn't anything that could ever get into the budget to go out and do all that data collection. So trying to update the expenditures, get a detailed expenditure survey would maybe be ideal, but has not been practical, and therefore we've been continuing to use pretty much the same market basket as our starting point for the PIOC. The other issues that could be coming along here are we could have some errors in the item weights within each of the components. How much is painting versus boiler repair, or gas versus electricity versus water, the items within the components. The component weights could have shifted. But really the main one is the quantities are likely to have changed over time. In any particular year, those changes are likely to be small. When you start looking over a 20-year period, though, they can build up over time. You know, as, for example, you know, landlords may make investments in energy efficiency, buy new boilers, things like that, which would change the amount of oil and gas that they use. Or they may do other things that increase their costs in other areas. And we don't have a way in the PIOC at this point, short of going out and doing an expenditure survey, to automatically capture those increased efficiencies. So here's the other data source. Every year, owners submit RPIE statements of their expenses for buildings with 11 or more units. And those are summarized, actual tax bills get added, and the RGB gets summary information, broken down pretty well by borough, unit, building size, other categories, but really summary information of operating costs along with the other things that go into the income and expenditure survey. We then use information based on the housing and vacancy survey on how many units there are in each size of building by each borough to calculate a set of weights and come up with an adjusted set of data from the income and expenditure survey that we use for the I&E report. Limitations? Well, it doesn't include the very smallest buildings that we stabilize. But then the bigger limitation, and the one that really makes a difference here, is that it's over a year after the end of the reporting period before we actually see the data. Now, it would be hard to we can't, for example, simply replace the PIOC with the I&E information because we'd be using 2012 data to make 2014 decisions. Things change in the real world faster than that. There are a few other limitations that really wind up being fairly minor. There's been some changes in the methodology over time. For example, originally the tax data was as reported by the owners. Later on, it's been calculated from, or provided by finance. There have been some reclassifications of things from one of their categories to another. Fairly minor changes over time, but there have been some methodology changes. And obviously, filing is never 100%. Nothing is ever 100% in the real world. And there may be some small errors in classification, but those are all fairly minor. So since we're showing some differences between the PIOC and the I&E, one of the questions was reasons. And in the report, you'll see some more documentation of these, but the I&E data might not be representative of the population of stabilized buildings because of excluding the 6 to 10 units. That's a possibility. Possibility 2 was that the owners could consistently be over or under reporting their costs for the I&E, which is certainly possible, but since what we're looking at is the changes in costs, it's harder to see how that could actually have a real effect on the analysis we're doing. PIOC specifications might not be representative. We might be looking at a level of paint. We have a spec for painting a one-bedroom apartment. If no landlords were actually painting one-bedroom apartments with anything close to those specs, we might have a problem. But those have been adjusted over time to try to make them pretty good. Price and expense increases are not the same. Certainly a truism, but doesn't really tell us very much. And then back to my main one, which is the owners may shift their expenditure patterns over time. So looking at that one, as I've said, the PIOC assumes that they buy the same market of services as they did in the original expenditure survey. We know that's, just from basic logic and a little bit of economics, we know that's not going to be the case over a 20-year period. And that's the one that I at least believe is the key issue here for why there's been the difference between the PIOC and the INE. So, given that, and without taking the giant step of going out and doing a full detailed expenditure survey, trying to get a high enough compliance rate on the landlord surveyed, et cetera, without going out to that step, what can we do to try to bring these things together? And there's really 3 areas where we can make things better, one of which is, I think, more important than the other 2. And that one is to try to use the expenditures that we get from the INE for example, right at the moment, 2012, as the basis for the component weights in the price index for 2014. Instead of using expenditure weights that came out from 1980 or 1989, we'll try to use expenditure weights from 2012. And there are a couple of small technical issues related to that. The first one is that the 2012 weights to be useful for the PIOC, well, that's actually my number 2 point there, but the 2012 weights to be useful for the PIOC have to be updated to 2013, but we have a way to do that. The other one is that the components that are provided in the INE data are not identical to the components we've been using in the PIOC. For example, they have a miscellaneous category. We have a replacements cost category that measures somewhat different things. They have a fuel category that includes oil and gas. In our analysis, heating gas and heating steam have been included in the utilities category. There's shifts like that among the various items that we had to take into account. Overall, though, if we look at the weights that we had in the INE versus the PIOC by component for 2013, actually the INE side of that is 2012. The PIOC, I believe is the 2013. We're seeing similar weights on taxes and labor, actually similar weights on fuel. Utilities was higher in the PIOC. Administration, largely because it includes more, was higher in the INE. Insurance was showing up as a lot higher in the INE. And then the maintenance in the INE was lower. A lot of similarities, but a few areas where there are some differences, most of which are accounted for by the fact that the categories on the left are measuring slightly different sets of items than the categories on the right. I'm sorry I don't have a lot of pretty graphs like the mortgage survey report, but so it goes. The other thing that we can do, so the main issue is dealing with the overall expenditure weights and trying to bring the INE data in. We can also do some things on the PIOC side to try to modify the item weights within a particular category. For example, when we're doing the owner surveys annually, in 1 year we might be able to go out and say, for your maintenance expenditures, how much money do you as an owner spend in each of these categories, and use that for each of these particular types of things. Furnace repair, painting, cleaning services, et cetera, and use those to modify the item weights that we use in the PIOC. And as long as we're not trying to do that for the whole set of expenditures all at one time, as long as we're doing a section of that every year, we can be on a continuous improvement process to make the item weights in PIOC better each year over time. We also, as we're doing that, have the option of trying to, as the staff has done many times over the years, retire a specification for an item that landlords are no longer buying, add in a specification for an item that is now being bought, improve the sources, for example, dealing with more pricing of internet providers rather than just brick and mortar stores, because that's where a lot of the purchases are being done now. Make those sorts of improvements in the specifications and process for the items. And again, that can be a continuing improvement process. So, as has been true from the beginning, the PIOC is still going to measure primarily prices. It's not going to measure costs. The costs we get a couple years later. Given the data that we've got from the I&E weights and the way the methodology works, it'll be hard to do a master metered index using a new methodology, starting from the I&E side as the base weights. We also have similar issues in not really being able to do hotel and lofts because we don't get any specific hotel and loft data from the I&E study. So we'll pretty much have to stay with the existing methodology for those. And as you know, the PIOC report is full of a lot of 20 and 30-year analyses, graphical analyses, for example, of how things have been changing over time for the whole time series. If we do shift how we develop the expenditure weights and modify some of the categories around, it'll be hard to make apples-to-apples comparisons from, say, 2005 under one methodology to 2014 or 15 under the other. So that may give us some challenges in exactly how we present things. Overall, though, the PIOC has been diverging further from the actual reported costs by the landlords over time. And I say there's been some evidence. I certainly have come to believe that evidence, that a major cause of that is the old baseline and the expenditure data. And we've been hoping to find a way to deal with that for quite a while. The I&E data, it seems to me, provides a great source for working with that. So my proposal is that we move over to using the 2 years back I&E data to create the component weights for the PIOC. And this year we do that on a trial basis. Make it part of the PIOC report for you folks to look at and decide whether to fully shift over moving forward. And then if we do move in that direction, we try to work toward, or actually either way, we can try to work toward improving the item weights with any of the components. One component a year, working through the owner survey to try to get the detailed expenditure weights for items within a component. And I also think we should do something to try to improve the expenditure weights for the hotel and loft surveys, but I'm not really quite sure how we should be doing that. I think that one can wait a year or two as we figure it out. And that's pretty much it. So I'm ready for questions.
If I may? I have a number of questions for
Please.
you. I guess the first one is, in your report, you indicate that one of the problems with the reliance on the I&E data is that it does not reflect buildings of less than 11 units, correct?
Correct.
And one thing that I don't understand in your report, this is at page 6, you say that 6 to 10 unit buildings actually make up 42.1% of all stabilized buildings in the 2013 PIOC tax sample. but only 9.2% of the stabilized residential units. I just don't understand that disparity. Could you
Well-
just explain that a little bit better?
Sure, I mean, let me take a simple example. Let's say you have a 100-unit building, and well, let's say a 10-unit building. So you need 10 of those 10-unit buildings to make up the same number of units as the 100-unit building. So you can have a very high percentage of buildings that are in the small size, but they still wind up being only, in this case, about 10% of the residential units that are covered, just because there are a lot more units in the bigger buildings. And it's that simple.
Are you saying then that the weight that the building size has in the PIOC analysis is just smaller? That's what, I just don't understand how a measure that doesn't take into account 42% of the population that we are considering is in any way a good measure. I mean, I think that's a major problem with the INE index. I mean, I think what you're trying to indicate here is that that's not, you're diminishing the import of that omission. Am I misreading you?
Well, I don't think I'd use a word like diminishing myself, but
Okay.
we can use whatever terms we wish on that. I guess what I would say is that in certain areas like the tax analysis, certainly we include all of those buildings individually because we get the population run that includes all of those.
And the tax component is a fairly large one, what,
Very large. one.
right? Approximately what percent?
It was about 25% under both the INE data
And the PIOC.
and the PIOC
Yes.
data, yes. But I did a couple of analyses looking at how much different the expenditures would have to be in the 6 to 10 unit buildings compared to the 11 plus unit buildings that were reported to, for example, make up the difference between the growth rate in the INE overall versus the growth rate in the PIOC overall. And to make up that difference, we would have had to have a growth rate of expenditures in the 6 to 10 unit buildings that was, and I'd have, let me look.
Page 7, Jim.
Yes, page 6 and 7. Okay, so a couple of things I did. One is I looked at what the growth rate of cost was for the 3 building sizes that we had available. And the 11 to 19, the 20 to 99, and the 100 plus had over a 5-year period, well, 4-year period was what I looked at, had very similar growth rates and expenditures. So if we had seen, for example, that costs grew by 20% in the 11 to 19 unit buildings, 10% in the 20 to 99s, and 5% in the 100 pluses, then there might be some evidence, or at least an indicator, that the 6 to 10s were, likely to have grown very fast. As it was, I didn't see that difference among the 3. Now, we could potentially go back and do that for a wider range of years, and that might be a good idea. But using the INE data to see if we had an indication that there was, for example, a much larger cost growth under the 6 to 10s, I think would be a good idea. Okay. So the other thing is I did a few analyses, a little bit of which is here, but really most of which was just running scenarios on the spreadsheets, looking at how much the increase in the 6 to 10 unit buildings would have had to be to make up the difference of growth rates compared to the PIOC. And it was looking at, over a 20-year span, needing to have been seeing increases in the 15% a year range. every year in those small buildings to make up the difference from the PIOC. So I think we still have evidence about the PIOC diverging from the I&E and I think from the actual operating costs. I do agree with you that excluding the 6 to 10 unit buildings is a drawback, is something that we should try to find a way to get some better data and deal with. But I don't think that they have been showing consistently, actually I don't have any evidence that they have been showing consistently different growth rates in operating costs than the larger buildings.
Clearly, it's
So
not.
lack of
it's
evidence
it's
is not
You don't
evidence.
have the data to support
True.
that statement. You clearly recognize that there's a great divergence between the PIOC indices and the I&E. But I always understood that the PIOC, and this is reflected in your report and in your presentation, is a survey of actual costs. Not of costs, what an owner, if he or she needed to go out in the marketplace, would have to spend in order to obtain any of these particular items that they need to run their buildings. So the PIOC is reflecting something that's very different than the I&E indices, which is, this is what I've actually spent, right? Which is limited by what the rental stream is for a building. So if there is limited rent coming in for a building, wouldn't it be logical to assume that the owner would spend less for certain expenses, would incur less expenditures in making maintenance for their building, or would seek out more economical ways of supplying heat for its building, would limit the amount of improvements to its building if it's not getting, in other words, the I&E data is limited to the extent that it's constrained by what an owner has in order to make those expenditures, which is very different from the PIOC. The PIOC is reflecting what is out there in the marketplace, what it costs in order to obtain certain items necessary to run a building. It's like, to me, it's apples and oranges, and I think you're trying to find a way to combine the two, and the board has traditionally gotten both sets of information, and the board members then, with this information, makes an assessment of what the appropriate increase should be, taking into account these two universes. I'm having a lot of trouble trying to put these together.
I guess actually what I'd say on this one is that both are trying to provide an estimate of operating costs. And yes, operating costs are clearly going to be constrained by the amount of money that one has available to spend. In the PIOC, the individual item prices are just that. They're prices that we go out and get. The question is how we turn them into an estimate of the overall cost change in operating costs from year to year. And that's where these weights come from. And the original expenditure survey back in the 80s looked at actual expenditures over a year, not some platonic ideal of what the expenditure should be. Right. The I&E looks at actual expenditures in a year. So I think it is a better baseline, largely because being more current.
Can I just add to that? Because I think that's really an important piece you've raised here. Like in the past, the price index has been used as an estimate of what the change in costs that might affect an owner. But what we've highlighted today is, let's say in my building, electric prices, the price of electricity might go up, but our usage could go down by 20% because of more energy efficient issues going on in our building. So even though the price of the electricity went up, the actual cost to the owner could have gone down substantially. And when we're looking at the PIOC, it only reflects the increase in cost, not the actual usage. And what we're saying here is there seems to be a divergence between owners' income and expenses to the PIOC. And we've seen, it sounds like you're saying in the last 10 years, that divergence has been somewhat substantial, and that the PIOC then it seems to be an outdated formula in talking about what actually happening in our buildings. So is that a summary of what you're saying to us?
I think that's accurate in what
Okay.
I've been saying.
Thank you.
I have to say, I actually agree with what you're saying, Harvey.
Magda, that's great.
May this be a moment to be reflected.
That's
I
actually recorded history.
Yeah.
Videotape.
It is.
When nycrgb.org.
We are in agreement with that perspective, absolutely. Where I think we might disagree is the effort to bring these two very different indices together. The components are different, the time frame, I mean, we already heard all the differences. I think that the way the board has operated in the past is to be given the two sets, the two bodies of information, and then the board members take those two divergent sets of facts and come up, understanding the problems with each set, come up with some reasonable guideline.
So
Not that one is the PIOC controls or that the I&E information controls. I think they are two different sets of information as you've correctly and accurately indicated.
I appreciate that we agree, Magda, and that's good to know. But I think where we diverge is kind of the use of the PIOC going forward. I have some, and we've raised this in the past, and I've raised this in the past, of the real reliance on using the price index, where if we could get income and expense statement, a more accurate income and expense statement, maybe not 2-year-old data, but 1-year-old data, that would be the most efficient information that we would have and effective in helping us make a decision. And I think in some ways thinking about not focusing resources of the Rent Guidelines Board in collecting that PIOC and collecting information on the price index, when we know that information is in some ways not useful information. It's information that won't give us real data. It won't give us information of what's really affecting it, that's affecting the industry. And real I&E data may be much more effective in helping us make our decision.
There we disagree. The PIOC clearly is an important measure because it is reflecting the costs in the marketplace. Whether they are the actual costs, as you gave the example of the more efficient use and providing electricity, you're right. It might cost X dollars to buy electricity, but I'm going to spend less because I'm going to use some energy efficient methodology to provide electricity to my building. That's different. The PIOC has its place, and there are many problems with it, but it has its place in the overall analysis. And I think when we are receiving the PIOC report, there's also all these different measures that the staff does for us that gives us different PIOC percentages and numbers, So I don't agree at all in eliminating the PIOC from our analysis. And by the way, it's also in the statute that requires us to consider price indexes.
Can I ask a question? You're proposing to adjust the PIOC each year going forward based on the previous I&E studies. Have you gone back and recreated an adjusted PIOC for the last 15 years using that methodology, so we have some back data on that methodology going forward? and to compare the correlation between the two then adjusted indexes?
We have not yet done that. We did one trial just this last week, and, you know, it's been through one set of eyes in the spreadsheets, so it's going to take some look. But I'll give you the preliminary numbers, which is we redid last year based on the previous PIOC and using this methodology. And when we applied it through the overall index, which I believe was 5.9,
Yes.
came out 5.2 with the INE-based approach.
But I think it'd be interesting to see the two
I think the
over
series
time
would be
and look
really
at the
interesting,
correlation.
yes, yes. I think that's a really good idea.
And how long would it take you to, I mean, can you do that for in this 6-week period that we're looking at?
That would be a heavy haul. We'll have to see. And that's why I think Jim recommended moving forward with just doing the methodology we've always done with the price index at the same time doing the INE adjusted weights. But just to get back to this question, the price index will always measure prices the same way. We're not going to change that.
Right, it's the components,
The
right?
components,
The components.
we're changing some of the items that don't exist or are not purchased anymore. That's the point there. But the methodology of the price index is not going to be changed. Just simply the expenditure weights of what the owners are spending on and the item weights. So you will still be measuring price. So it will not include quantity. So from that standpoint, we are still going to get that. This whole, I think, intent was to simply make the price index expenditure weights current. It's not designed to change how the measure is, what the measure and price change. That's not the point of this endeavor. It's just to make the expenditure weights and what owners are more current. That's simply the idea. Is that the best way to put that?
I think that's great, thank you.
Yeah, and it's not, and looking at numbers, whether that in some years that may have an impact of a lower price index than the INE expenses, it depends on what's happening with price, to be honest. So it wasn't a question of looking at that. It was a question of making sure what the price index does is current, but the methodology to measure those prices are not. It's not. That's not going to be something that's changed.
And Andrew, just to get the 1-year-old data instead of 2-year-old data, is that something that's not, that can't be get by the Rent Guidelines Board? Is there some legislative problem with collecting that data that's newer data?
In terms of what? In terms of
Getting INE data that's 1-year-old instead of 2-year-old?
we don't have the ability to request INE data from owners at this point. What we do is get it from the Department of Finance.
And do they have 1-year-old data since they've been collected?
Well,
at
the
end of
next set of data will be from the calendar year 2012, right? So we are in the process of getting that. So you're talking about a difference of like 14, 15 months, that from what the data that we get for the calendar year versus, current price data from up to this month that we present to the board.
And just the 6 to 10 building exclusion for INE, that's a legislative issue?
Yeah, it's just part of the law. They don't have to file, and buildings that are assessed for less than $40,000 don't have to file, as well. So that's the limitation there, and that won't change with the INE either.
That won't change.
So that's an issue. That's something that that has a flaw with the INE data. But again, it's bringing things in the price index current. But not
Can I just one last question? Is there any reason to believe that the expenses for owners of buildings that are fewer than 10 units are widely different from owners who have 11 to 19? That's the information we're saying. How do we I understand that it would require legislative change to require owners to submit that data, but do we think, based on your experience doing this for many years, that information would be wildly different?
No, I wouldn't, without data, I wouldn't want to comment on that.
Okay.
Good
All
answer.
to say that the price index does capture 6 to 10 unit buildings.
That's right, which
So
is,
that in that sense, it's trying to capture all stabilized apartments. So that's trying to do that.
speaking to that point, I wonder if the staff could look at the real estate tax sample of the PIOC, that component, and let us know how many total units and buildings and how many of those are buildings with less than 11 units, so that we understand that breakdown as part of the PIOC. Thank you.
We can do that.
I know you can.
One of the things we can do.
Can I actually make it just a quick, actually I had a question, but also a statement.
Sarah, can you turn your mic on? Is it on?
It is on, I'm
Oh,
just,
it is.
sorry, being a little
Sorry.
soft-spoken. The exclusion of the 6 to 10, actually, thinking about it from an owner's perspective, there are economies of scale that come with the larger buildings. That's ranges, unfortunately, or fortunately, not everything is linear when it comes to operating expenses as well as repairs and maintenance or incentive to invest in energy-saving equipment, upgrading equipment, all of those things. When you have fewer units to amortize over, these things, the sunk cost aspect of it, it's not linear when you look at the smaller buildings. So for me, just personally, understanding the expense increases in the smaller buildings is an important factor, because I do recognize that there are some distinctions between a very buildings that have economies of scale versus the smaller unit buildings. You may have covered this, and I apologize if I'm asking you to repeat yourself, but could you explain to me exactly how the weighting calculation works currently? Like just the numerator and the denominator, I see these percentages, but I just wasn't clear actually what the percentages are, how they are calculated.
I can try. Doing this in words without a blackboard could be a challenge, but let's give it a try. So in a particular year, we've got prices on, 80 items, price changes on each of those. And we start the year with a set of weights of, here's relatively how important we consider each of those is in calculating the index. So weight times price divided by the sum of the weights, which is 1, is the overall index. We take those values of weight times price and whatever they add up to, and they're going to add up overall to whatever the price index is, 1.07 perhaps. So, and we divide those all by the 1.07 to get the weights for the next year, which then by definition will add up to 1. So that's how the weights increase over time based on the price changes in each item in each year. If taxes goes up more than number 2 heating fuel in 1 year, the weight for taxes will be higher the next year than the weight for the number 2 fuel. And that's the change in weights over time. So the assumption may be that they're still buying 1,000 gallons of fuel or 10,000 gallons of fuel each year. Mm-hmm. But the weight of that will depend on the continuing changes in prices year to year as the time goes forward.
And it's from a trailing 12, so it's assuming, looking at the last year, how that weight gets for this year. Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Sure.
Sarah, can I ask you for a clarification? Are you distinguishing between a small owner who has a small number of buildings versus like a small building that a large property owner could maintain 100 small buildings? You see a distinction there?
No, I'm not making a distinction about the ownership capacity, or I think, I'm not sure which one of you raised about the available capital for, in terms of the owner capacity.
Right.
I'm talking about purely just looking at the building itself. A building that has 6 to 10 units would likely have a different economies of scale than a building that has 200 units.
No matter who the ownership entity is.
It's irrespective of the ownership entity. It's just purely the building function.
Because it seems to make a difference if you have a large ownership entity that has large numbers of 6 to 10 buildings. Unit-sized buildings, they have economies of scale in their offices to do the billing and the back office functioning and kind of the operational of having more super versus a small owner with a small number of buildings don't have that system support.
Actually, so usually back office typically can be looked at through the management fee, and that's usually a percentage of revenue off of that individual building. So, maybe purchasing power, if you were a large owner, an owner that owns a number of units might have purchasing power, some maybe efficiencies in the cost, but as it relates to operating expenses of the individual building, and again, I'm not qualifying ownership, I'm just qualifying the actual physical asset. It's almost, not entirely, but primarily in majority mutually exclusive from any other building, particularly when you use metrics like management fee as a percentage of revenue, which is just based off the revenue of that individual asset.
Right, thanks.
Is there additional board business discussions?
I guess, Jim, thank you for coming by.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Great questions, thanks.
I do have a couple, if that's at all possible. I did notice that our preliminary vote on May 5th is scheduled for 5:30 in the evening, and I know that we want to have votes accessible for people in the public to attend, and I really am concerned that 5:30 is not a good time for people, especially working New Yorkers, to be able to be available. I would encourage this board to push that time back to 6:30 or 7, so people who actually work can get there in time to actually be a part of the preliminary vote. So I hope that the board would agree to that and just push that time back from 5:30 to 6:30.
Just a point, the chair sets all the meetings and times, and to deference of not having a chair, I would recommend we hold off on that discussion until a chair is in place. There's no reason why that can't be discussed further, but give that person an opportunity to come in and do that.
Unless, I totally appreciate that, Andrew. I'm just not sure if, I don't want to, I know we have 2 weeks, we'll have another chair in place, but if we're getting this information out and it's on our website, and that's information that the public has, unless there's real opposition to moving it back an hour, I do encourage us to.
I agree with Andrew. I think we should wait until we have some leadership to address those kinds of issues.
I think that the importance of having the time pushed back, it's real. I think that many working tenants, many working families would really appreciate to be able to testify and have their opinions and their voices and their real, because we're calculating and we're seeing all of these expenses from a landlord-owner's perspective, and I feel like, hearing the tenant's perspective would be as important as far as how they see and what they see in their buildings.
Actually, I think, are you referring to the public hearings?
Yes.
Oh, okay, so this meeting is not a public comment period, but
Right.
certainly public hearings that.
But I think it's
which I'm-
important for the tenants to be involved in all of the process, including
Sure,
the preliminary
abs-
vote. I would also say that it would be really beneficial to think about having more hearings for public testimony from tenants, from owners to come and making them official in the 4 outer boroughs. I know that Staten Island, as we all mentioned, they don't have a majority, a large portion of rent-stabilized tenants, and I think it's really beneficial for Bronx tenants to have their own hearing in their borough, to be able to speak out and really voice their opinions, as well as all of the other 3 boroughs.
Sorry, can to go back to the earlier question about moving the time, I would just have you consider, just as a working mother, I have that same push and pull of balancing my work day, but also, trying to get home to my children to put them to bed. So if you don't mind, if we could wait until we do have a chairperson in place to make that decision, because I could see both sides of it. It's not just about the work schedule, it's also the life schedule, too.
Yep. We all do.
I
If
like
I-
to get
if
home
I
before my
may.
kids go to bed.
I agree with Andrew and David that the procedure is that the chair sets those times. And we don't have a chair, so therefore, we should wait until we have a chair.
So the only thing I would add to what Shayla said is that last year, when we only had one public hearing, and it was in Manhattan, and it happened almost exclusively during the day, I know I felt that was extremely problematic, and I think what we need to see this year, and I appreciate people wanting to wait for a chair, but I really feel like what we need to do is commit to having more hearings this year in the evening, accessible to people, for owners and tenants around the city who can go after work, and to be able to listen to what they have to say and their concerns. And it was unacceptable that we only had one hearing in Manhattan. And I would encourage all of us to, at our next meeting on April 10th, to finalize this then, and to say and commit to the residents of the over 1 million apartments in the city, tenants and property owners, that we're going to go to your borough. And I would encourage Andrew to find sites between now and April 10th, hopefully, that we have available, because it shortens our time frame to be able to get to meetings in Queens and the Bronx and Brooklyn. And I would say that if we are going to wait till then, I appreciate that we don't have a chair, that at that point, we move quickly to get sites in those boroughs in the evening and make it available to people of the city of New York.
I don't mind deferring till the chair is in place. However, I want to go on record that I have a strong recommendation that we do make the meeting available, or change the time to 6:30 to make it more available to folks that work, given the push and pull. Secondarily, I guess, as a proud Brooklynite, I wouldn't mind having meetings in all the boroughs. I'm just curious why we haven't had it ever before. Historic.
I think it's one of the few boards that actually does go out to borough hearings, which we have done, except for last year, for the previous 8 years. We had gone out to alternating boroughs, but we'd have a Manhattan hearing that was central to everyone in the city to get to, and then we went out to one of the boroughs. So this board, I think, I can proudly say, has reached out to the boroughs in the past.
Okay, fair enough.
And I don't think that, that it's not something that certainly could be done this year. So but there is and I would say a proud history of this board going out to the outer boroughs and listening, which other boards do not do. So,
Often the attendance was not very strong.
Oh,
in the outer
interesting.
boroughs.
and we've
I
had,
think
and
that
we've
that
had.
was-
and
last year, they did have an unofficial public hearing, which both Harvey and Brian Chan went to, and there were over 200 advocates, tenant members who were there to testify, and they did try to show the videos at the last RGB hearings where they were able to speak. So I feel like maybe the movement was, there wasn't movement, but I think that this year, if we were to push forward to have 4 auto borough hearings, it would be a great success, and tenants across and landlords who might be managing their buildings and need to wait until a little later to come out will appreciate.
Andrew, I would agree that we've had a history of having one at a borough hearing. I think what we're asking for this year is in the 4 boroughs, that there be a hearing in each one of those boroughs, and that we create a method of making these hearings available to people where they live, and not just choose Queens or choose the Bronx. I think we need to have consistency so people know that in the Bronx, this is where you're going to have your hearing, and every year have it in those 4 boroughs and make it accessible to people who live there and work there.
Not being the chair, I can't say that will happen without the chair having some comment in setting the schedule, and certainly everyone can talk to the chair. If that is the consensus of the chair and the board, then outside heroes. But
Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I second.
That concludes this meeting of the Rent Guidelines Board. Our next meeting will be here, April 10, starting at 9:30. And thank you very much, everyone.
Thank
Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.